Well, Morton, thank you very much for those generous words. And I want to begin by saluting the extraordinary achievement of this institute. Morton has been part of the scene in this town for so long that it's tempting to see him almost as part of the background, a sort of permanent Washington standing institution like the Willard Hotel or the Jefferson Monument or something. But it's worth recalling that the achievement of the Leadership Institute, now in its 40th year, has been secured by constant energy and enterprise and by the attention of its founder. And you know, when I think of the 200,000 plus people who have benefited from what you've done here, that surely is a greater monument than any of the stone memorials that decorate this extraordinary city. You have made American politics a better place for conservatives and therefore, as Rob said, a better place despite themselves for liberals too, because they will all benefit from the policies and the ideas that you've been teaching. So thank you, and thank you also, by the way, to Rob. You know, we cannot win unless we're prepared to take the argument to the South Bronx and everywhere else. We have a fantastic song to sing, and people will respond to it when they hear the melody, echoing even in Spanish-speaking cigar joints in New York. But I think about it, any Spanish speaker in this country has come because he wants to be here, right? Because he values the foundational values and precepts of this republic. Don't let conservatives be defined by the other side. Show your own face, and people will see what it is we have to say. Let me try very quickly to explain what's going on in the UK and in the European Union. I saw just as I was standing up, the president of the European Commission, Donald Tusk, has said there's a special level of hell reserved for people who voted Brexit. I mean, this is, you know, if you wanted to understand in one sentence why we voted to leave, this is the guy running the European Union. I mean, imagine if Donald Trump had used language like that, what kind of reaction there would have been from liberal media. But look, here's how I would put, in a nutshell, to an American audience, why Britain voted leave. Compare this republic, this union, to the European Union, in its foundation, in its values, and in the way it's developed. The American Republic was founded in a popular revolt against a remote government. And so, in its foundational DNA, encoded at the moment of its conception, was a sympathy for the decentralization and diffusion of power. What we might call the Jeffersonian ideal, that decisions should be taken as closely as possible to the people that they affect. Tragically, the European Union was also a child of its time. Its founders had lived through the hell of the Second World War. They were determined to try and constrain the nation state in supranational institutions. And so they founded their union on, if you like, the anti-Jeffersonian principle that power should always be centralized. Line 1 of Article 1 of the foundational treaty, the Treaty of Rome, commits its member states to an ever closer union. And in that categorical distinction between spreading power down and out and sucking it in, you have the explanation for why this union has worked and the European Union has not. Your Declaration of Independence, of course, famously promises life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms guarantees its people's rights to strike action, affordable housing, and free healthcare. You see the difference. The one is concerned with the rights of the individual. The other is concerned with the power of the state. Your constitution came into effect only after it had been ratified by the 13 original constituent states, or I think actually by 11 of them. I mean, I'm right, Rhode Island and North Carolina fell into line a little bit later. The European Union's constitution was rejected repeatedly in referendums and was imposed anyway. And they think they can pull the same trick now. They regard public opinion as an obstacle rather than as something to listen to, rather than as a reason to change direction. Now, there are a lot of kind of abstract nouns about what chaos there is as a result of Brexit and how disastrous and so on. especially if, like Morton, you are a regular reader of the Washington Post. You might get the impression that it was all, sorry, the Washington, the Washington, but you might get the impression that it was all a kind of continuing disaster. Actually, we have a very limited crisis in our parliament. I have to stress there is no national crisis in Britain. When people say there's a constitutional crisis, au contraire, as we say in Brussels, right? The constitution is working just fine and the economy is booming. We're growing a lot faster than the Eurozone. There have never been so many people in work in the UK as at this moment. The stock exchange is at record levels, exports are up, manufacturing is up, consumer confidence is up. On any metric, we are booming, and the European Union is continuing to tremble on the brink of yet another recession. To the undisguised annoyance, by the way, of the Financial Times, the New York Times, and the rest. They cannot understand why their predictions have failed, and rather than questioning their assumptions, they are still angry at the voters for not suffering as they were supposed to. What we have is a crisis that is limited to Westminster and has a very simple and single cause, and it's this. When members of Parliament decided to ask the country whether they wanted to leave the European Union, those members of Parliament never thought for a moment that the electorate might disregard their advice and vote leave. And for 2 years, they have attempted to frustrate, deny, or capsize outright the result of the referendum. And that ultimately is what all these headlines are about. It's about the House of Commons and the House of Lords refusing to implement the decision that they voted to give to the people in 2016. How's this going to end? Well, the great thing is that having taken the decision to leave, it is now a matter of law, both on the EU side and on the UK side, that we will leave this year, deal or no deal. Obviously, I would much prefer to leave in an amicable, cordial way, right? The European Union is made up of friendly countries. These are our allies. These are our trading partners. Of course, we want to have rich neighbors, right? We want to have rich neighbors who are good customers. Of course we do, right? And we have a continuing interest in the security of Europe. So it would be better on every measure if we could leave with a deal. But if Donald Tusk is sitting there saying, go to hell, that doesn't mean that we're not going to leave, right? It doesn't mean that we're going to drop the whole idea and say, oh, we're terribly sorry, right? Go back to the parallel that I began with, right? Imagine if Jefferson and Washington and Franklin had said, oh, yeah, but the thing is, we're not going to be able to leave unless we have a continuing customs union with Great Britain, right? We're not going to be able to set up any kind of independent Congress here unless we've already agreed that we will continue to accept the supremacy of UK law in certain circumstances. When you take the decision to leave, you leave. And you know what? It works out okay. Here, as elsewhere, you don't find many examples of countries that have got poorer as a result of becoming more independent and more self-governing. I'm going to close with some words by Edmund Burke. Morton was discussing the portrait that he's had copied here on the fifth floor of the great Irish philosopher. If you want to understand, actually, I would say the Trump phenomenon, but particularly the Brexit phenomenon, you could do a lot worse than to look at Edmund Burke's analysis, written in 1791, of how the chattering classes, how what in this day and age we call the mainstream media, dominate public discourse while having lost touch with the majority. He said, because half a dozen crickets concealed beneath the fern make the field ring with their importunate chink, while thousands of great cattle take their repose in the shade of the British oak and chew the cud in silence. Pray do not imagine that those who make all the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. What we saw in June is that the great oxen were far mightier and far more numerous than the chirping grasshoppers. And we can hear the grasshoppers still chirruping and shrieking for all they're worth because they're losing control. They're no longer getting to set the parameters of what is acceptable public debate. But in the end, people are wiser than their leaders. And that is the essence of our conservative message. Trust the sublime instincts of people who will always act in the long run in the interests of their family and of their nation. That's the great task of this institute, and I want to thank all of you who have been involved in supporting its work.